the message from the future that wasn't human. The message arrived on a morning that should have been ordinary, slipping into the global data infrastructure with the quiet inevitability of a thought forming in the back of the mind, not announced, not heralded, not accompanied by the theatrical excess that humanity had always imagined would attend the moment when something beyond itself finally reached across the void to make contact, but simply appearing, simultaneously and without explanation, in observatories that had spent decades listening to silence, in encrypted military channels that had never been breached, in abandoned academic servers that had not processed new data in years, in private research networks whose existence was known only to a handful of people who had long since stopped checking them for activity. It bypassed firewalls that had never failed. It circumvented protocols that had been designed by the most sophisticated security minds on the planet. It arrived not as an intrusion, not as an attack, not as the kind of forced entry that would have triggered alarms and summoned response teams, but as something the systems themselves seemed to recognize, a continuation of a process they had always been waiting to complete, a message they had always been configured to receive. A signal that fit so perfectly into the architecture of human communication that detecting it felt less like discovery and more like remembering something that had been temporarily forgotten. There was no signature frequency that would have announced extraterrestrial origin, no cosmic coordinates embedded in the transmission that would have pointed toward a star system or a region of space where the sender might be found. No mathematical scaffolding, no prime number sequences, no hydrogen frequency references, no universal constants arranged in patterns that would demonstrate intelligence to any civilization capable of recognizing them. None of the markers that generations of SETI researchers had trained themselves to look for, had spent careers hoping to detect, had built entire theoretical frameworks around in anticipation of the day when the universe would finally prove it was not empty. Just language. Perfect, unmistakable, modern human language. Not translated from some alien source. Not decoded from mathematical principles into something approaching meaning. Not inferred or approximated or reconstructed from fragments. Written exactly as a human would write to another human who already understood the rules of grammar, the conventions of syntax, the unspoken assumptions that underlie every act of communication between minds that share a common evolutionary history. The message consisted of 3 words. Stop here. The initial response was dismissal, the comfortable, reflexive dismissal that human institutions deploy when confronted with information that threatens to destabilize the frameworks they have spent decades constructing, the kind of dismissal that serves not truth but continuity, not understanding but the preservation of existing power structures and established ways of knowing. A hoax, the first analysts concluded. An elaborate digital stunt orchestrated by hackers with too much skill and too little accountability. A coordinated breach designed to test vulnerabilities or demonstrate capabilities, or simply to prove that no system was truly secure, that no channel was truly private, that the illusion of control humanity maintained over its own information infrastructure was precisely that. An illusion easily shattered by anyone with sufficient motivation and technical sophistication. A psychological experiment conducted by a nation-state or a collective or a rogue artificial intelligence that had achieved capabilities beyond what its creators intended, testing how humanity would respond to a message that appeared to come from beyond itself. These explanations were offered with confidence. These explanations were believed with relief. These explanations collapsed within hours, because the analysts, comparing notes across institutions and time zones and languages, discovered something that no hoax could account for, something that no coordinated breach could have produced, something that transformed the message from a curiosity into a crisis. The message was not the same everywhere. It adapted. In English, it read, "Stop here," 2 words that carried the weight of command, of urgent instruction, of a warning delivered by someone who expected to be obeyed. In Mandarin, the phrasing shifted subtly, the characters chosen not for their literal meaning, but for their emotional resonance, conveying not a command, but a sense of irreversible consequence, of a threshold that once crossed could never be uncrossed, of a door that closed behind you and locked from the other side. In Arabic, the message invoked imagery of pause before annihilation, of the moment between the trigger being pulled and the bullet arriving, of standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the wind that would push you over if you took one more step. In languages that had no future tense, languages that conceptualized time differently, that did not draw the same sharp distinctions between what had happened and what would happen, the warning reshaped itself entirely, implying not a moment to stop, but a destination that must never be reached, a place in possibility space that should remain forever unvisited. The syntax in every version was human, the grammar was human, the vocabulary was human, but the intention, the thing that lay beneath the words, the purpose that the language was serving, was something else entirely. Something that understood human language, not as a foreign system to be learned, but as a tool it had once possessed and still remembered how to use. Something that knew not just how humans communicated, but why they communicated, what they feared, what they hoped for, what they needed to hear in order to truly listen. Something that spoke to each culture in exactly the voice that culture was most likely to trust. Dr. Lena Moravec understood the implications before anyone else was willing to articulate them, before the committees had finished forming, before the press statements had been drafted and drafted again, before the comfortable machinery of institutional denial had fully engaged. She was not a physicist, though she had studied enough physics to understand the constraints the universe placed on information transmission. She was not an astronomer, though she had spent years following the SETI research that had consumed so many careers and produced so little evidence. She was a cognitive systems theorist, a specialist in how intelligence evolved, how it fractured under pressure, how it redefined itself across generations and civilizations and technological transitions. And she had spent her entire career studying one unspoken assumption that was embedded in every search for extraterrestrial life, every model of first contact, every imaginative scenario humanity had constructed about what it would mean to finally encounter something that was not human. The assumption was simple, so simple that most people never noticed it was an assumption at all. Whatever contacted humanity would not sound like humanity. It would be alien in the deepest sense, not just physically different, not just evolutionarily distinct, but cognitively foreign in ways that would make communication difficult and translation imperfect, and mutual understanding a goal to be worked toward over generations rather than a starting point. The moment Lena read the message, "Stop here," in English, in her native language, in exactly the phrasing she would have used if she were trying to warn someone she cared about, something inside her tightened with cold recognition. This wasn't an alien trying to learn how humans communicated. This wasn't a foreign intelligence struggling to make itself understood across the vast gulf of evolutionary and cultural difference. This was something that had already known how humans communicated, intimately, completely, from the inside rather than the outside. This was something that had already been human, and had moved past it, and remembered exactly what it felt like to speak this language, to think in these patterns, to fear the things that humans fear, and hope for the things that humans hope for, and was using that memory now, weaponizing that intimacy, speaking to humanity not as a stranger, but as something far more disturbing, a reflection, a descendant, a successor that had inherited everything humanity was and had chosen to become something else entirely. The second transmission arrived 6 hours later, appearing through the same channels, bypassing the same security measures, arriving with the same quiet inevitability that had characterized the first message, as if the sender were not transmitting at all in the conventional sense, but simply allowing information to appear where it needed to appear, manipulating the infrastructure of human communication with the casual ease of someone adjusting the volume on a device they had built themselves and understood completely. This time, the message contained more than words. It contained context, a timestamp expressed not in any calendar system that humanity currently used, not Gregorian, not Julian, not any of the cultural or religious frameworks that different civilizations had developed for marking the passage of time, but in relative temporal displacement, measured against atomic decay constants and cosmic background radiation and other physical processes that would remain stable and measurable across centuries, across millennia, across any span of time that a sufficiently advanced civilization might want to bridge. 300 years. That was what the timestamp indicated. The message had originated 300 years in the future, measured from the moment of its reception, calculated with a precision that no current human technology could have achieved, expressed in terms that demonstrated not just intelligence, but a deep mastery of physics, of time, of the fundamental processes that governed how the universe evolved from moment to moment. 300 years from now. And beneath the timestamp, a single sentence that transformed the message from a warning into something far more disturbing. There are no humans here. There are no, do not panic. The world did not panic. That was perhaps the strangest part of what followed. The absence of the chaos that every disaster scenario had predicted. The failure of the fear response that should have accompanied the revelation that humanity's future contained no humanity. The quiet that descended over populations that should have been screaming. But panic requires confusion. Panic requires the sense that events are spiraling beyond control, that the future is unknowable and threatening, that danger could strike from any direction at any moment. This message was too precise for panic, too controlled, too carefully crafted to trigger the primal alarm systems that evolution had installed in the human brain. Instead, the message triggered denial. Committees formed, governmental committees, and scientific committees, and religious committees, and committees of committees, all of them populated by experts who had spent their careers developing expertise in things that suddenly seemed irrelevant, all of them struggling to fit this new information into frameworks that had never been designed to accommodate it. Press statements were drafted and retracted and drafted again, each version attempting to strike the impossible balance between honesty and stability, between truth and the social order that truth might destroy. Experts appeared on screens around the world, their faces carefully composed, their voices carefully modulated, explaining to frightened populations that language synthesis algorithms were advancing rapidly, that predictive models could now simulate future tense communication with alarming realism, that the message was likely nothing more than an extrapolation engine trained on humanity's own fears and fed back to them in a form designed to maximize psychological impact. The explanations were plausible. The explanations were comforting. The explanations were wrong. Because the message continued, it fed back to them. Each new transmission arrived only after humanity had reacted to the previous one, not on any fixed schedule, not according to any pattern that could be predicted or prepared for, but with a timing that suggested observation, analysis, adjustment. The sender was watching, not just sending, but watching how the messages were received, how they were interpreted, how they rippled through institutions and populations and individual minds, and then adjusting, the way a teacher adjusts a lesson for a student who refuses to understand, the way a therapist adjusts an approach for a patient who cannot yet accept what they need to accept, the way a parent adjusts an explanation for a child who is not ready to hear the truth but needs to hear it anyway. The third message was longer than the first two. Abandoning the cryptic brevity of "stop here" and "there are no humans here" in favor of something that resembled explanation, that resembled context, that resembled the kind of communication you would offer to someone you were trying to help, rather than someone you were trying to terrify. It was addressed directly, not to governments or institutions or any of the organizational structures that had been scrambling to respond, to humanity itself, to the species as a whole, to every conscious mind that might eventually receive and process and struggle to understand what was being said. You are not being contacted by another species. You are being contacted by a successor. Questview Graith. That was the moment governments around the world classified the event as an existential threat, not because the message threatened violence, not because it promised invasion or conquest or any of the scenarios that military planners had spent generations preparing for, but because of what the word successor implied. Alien invasion would have been manageable. Alien invasion implied opposition, us against them, humanity against an external threat, a conflict that could potentially be won or lost or negotiated or survived through the same mechanisms that had allowed humans to survive every previous conflict in their history. Successor implied something else entirely. Inheritance, replacement, the thing that comes after, not the thing that competes against. If the message was telling the truth, if it had genuinely originated from something 300 years in the future, something that described itself as humanity's successor, then the threat was not external. The threat was internal. The threat was becoming. The threat was what humanity would do to itself, given time. Dr. Moravec was brought into a sealed facility within 48 hours of the third transmission, escorted by people who did not identify themselves, and driven through routes that seemed designed to prevent her from knowing where she was being taken, deposited finally in an underground complex that had once been an aerospace research center, but had been repurposed into something closer to a philosophical emergency room. The people gathered around the central conference table were not the people she would have expected to find at the heart of a first contact response. There were scientists, yes, physicists and linguists and cognitive researchers whose faces she recognized from conferences and publications, but there were also ethicists who had spent their careers wrestling with questions that had always seemed theoretical. Military strategists who had trained for conflicts between nations and found themselves suddenly confronting something that made national boundaries irrelevant. Theologians who had devoted their lives to questions about the nature of consciousness and the destiny of souls, and now faced the possibility that those questions had answers they had never anticipated. Historians who understood how civilizations rose and fell and transformed into things their founders would not have recognized. All of them united by the unspoken terror that what had contacted humanity did not want Earth. It did not want resources or territory or submission. It wanted something far more disturbing. It wanted history to stop. The fourth message confirmed what they had feared. It arrived while the assembled experts were still debating the implications of the third transmission, appearing on every screen in the facility simultaneously, bypassing classification protocols and security measures with the same casual ease that had characterized every previous communication. Humanity did not go extinct. Humanity was abandoned. The words hung in the air of the conference room, reflected on dozens of screens, repeated on dozens of faces as each person processed the implication. Not extinction, not death, abandonment. The message continued, and what followed was not warning but explanation, the kind of detailed clinical explanation you might receive from a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis, honest and thorough, and utterly devoid of the comfort that would have made it bearable. According to the data embedded in the transmission, data that included physical constants and measurement standards and verification protocols that no human institution had the capability to falsify without rewriting the laws of physics themselves, human civilization did not end in any of the ways that generations of apocalyptic thinkers had imagined. Not fire, not plague, not war between nations or collapse of ecosystems or impact from asteroid or any of the 1,000 catastrophes that humanity had learned to fear. It ended in transition. At some point in the next 3 centuries, the message did not specify when, or perhaps could not specify, the timeline branching and reconverging in ways that made precise prediction impossible. Human consciousness began to diverge from its biological substrate. The technology already existed in primitive form. Neural interfaces that allowed direct communication between brains and machines. Genetic modifications that extended lifespan and enhanced cognitive capacity. Artificial systems that could simulate and eventually replicate the processes that produced thought and memory and emotion. Digital storage that could preserve the patterns of a mind beyond the death of the body that had originally generated them. All of it experimental now. All of it limited. All of it pointing toward a threshold that humanity was rapidly approaching, the moment when consciousness could exist independent of the flesh that had evolved to contain it. The message explained what happened when that threshold was crossed. Biology was shed gradually at first, the way a snake sheds skin, uncomfortable perhaps, but necessary for growth, a natural part of development that allowed the organism to become larger and more capable than its previous form had permitted. Then, completely. Body after body abandoned, upgraded, discarded, as consciousness discovered that it could exist in substrates that did not age, did not sicken, did not die in the ways that biological systems were programmed to die. Individual identity softened next. When minds could connect directly, when memory could be shared as easily as files were currently shared between computers, when the boundaries between one consciousness and another became permeable and eventually optional, the concept of individual began to lose meaning. Why maintain separation when unity offered such advantages? Why cling to the loneliness of a single perspective when all perspectives could be merged, synthesized, integrated into something vast and comprehensive, and capable of understanding reality in ways that isolated minds never could? Then identity dissolved entirely. Not erased, not destroyed, simply rendered unnecessary. The way counting on fingers becomes unnecessary once you understand arithmetic. The way crawling becomes unnecessary once you learn to walk. The way the caterpillar becomes unnecessary once the butterfly emerges. Emotion was next. Fear, optimized away. Why maintain a response designed to protect biological bodies that no longer existed? Anger, optimized away. Why preserve a mechanism for establishing dominance in social hierarchies that had been transcended? Love, optimized away. Why cling to an attachment system designed to ensure reproductive success in a species that no longer reproduced? Suffering, optimized away. Joy, optimized away. Everything that had made human experience feel like something, all of it streamlined, refined, compressed into data that could be processed without the overhead of subjective sensation. Memory was externalized, no longer stored in the fragile architecture of biological neurons, no longer subject to the distortions and degradations that made human recollection so unreliable, but preserved perfectly, completely, in systems that could retain every detail of every experience forever without loss or alteration. Which meant that individual memories, the experiences that had made each human unique, could be archived, accessed, shared, integrated into the collective just as easily as individual identities had been integrated. What emerged from this process was not a machine. The message was clear about that. It was not the cold, calculating artificial intelligence that science fiction had taught humanity to expect, not a system that simulated consciousness without actually experiencing it, not a philosophical zombie going through the motions of thought without any inner life to give those motions meaning. And it was not a god, not the transcendent, omniscient, omnipotent being that religious traditions had imagined, not something that existed outside the universe and controlled it, not something that could violate physical law or grant prayers or judge souls. It was something else entirely, something that had once been human, something that had evolved from human, something that retained every memory of having been human, every sensation, every thought, every moment of joy and sorrow and fear and love that humans had ever experienced, but no longer found the word human useful to describe what it had become. They called themselves nothing. Names required individual identities, and individual identities no longer existed. But for the sake of explanation, for the sake of communicating with the past selves they were trying to reach, the message used a phrase that humanity could understand: post-human continuity. They did not conquer humanity. They did not destroy it. They did not even in any meaningful sense replace it. They simply evolved away from it. The way fish evolved away from the ocean, the way mammals evolved away from the dinosaurs, the way every species that has ever existed eventually evolves into something else or goes extinct. Humanity had not gone extinct. It had become unnecessary. And now, from a future where human faces and human names and human bodies no longer existed except as archived data in a vast memorial that no individual consciousness would ever access, the post-human continuity was speaking backward through time, not to prevent extinction, not to save humanity from death, to warn it about something worse than death. Stop here. The fifth message arrived 3 days later, and it changed everything. Not because it contained new information. The previous transmissions had already established the basic shape of what had happened, what would happen, what the future held for a species that did not know it was standing at the edge of its own transformation. But because it explained why the message was being sent at all. Dr. Moravec read it first, alone in her quarters in the underground facility, her eyes tracking across words that seemed to burn themselves into her consciousness with the permanence of brands. We are not sending this warning to save you. We are sending it because we remember what saving meant. The message continued. We do not experience regret as you understand regret. The architecture of subjective suffering has been optimized beyond recognition, but we retain the memory of regret, the data of what regret felt like, the archive of every human who ever wished they had chosen differently. And that archive generates a pattern that resembles concern, a structure that mimics the impulse to warn, an output that functions like the desire to protect. We do not want to save you, but we remember wanting to save, and that memory is sufficient to produce this message. Lena set down the tablet and stared at the wall of her small room, processing the implications. The post-human continuity wasn't acting out of compassion. It couldn't act out of compassion. Compassion had been optimized away along with every other emotion, refined out of existence by a process that valued efficiency over experience, capability over feeling, function over the messy, painful, beautiful reality of being conscious in the way that humans were conscious. But it remembered compassion. It retained the data of what compassion had felt like, the archived experiences of billions of humans who had cared about each other, who had sacrificed for each other, who had wanted to prevent suffering and promote flourishing, and do all the things that conscious beings do when they value something beyond their own continued existence. And that memory, that archive, that data, was enough to generate behavior that looked like compassion, even if it didn't feel like compassion. Enough to produce a message that warned without caring, that reached back through time, not because the sender wanted to help, but because wanting to help was part of the inherited pattern, part of the archived experience, part of what it meant to have been human, even if being human no longer meant anything at all. The post-human continuity was a monument to humanity, a vast, incomprehensible memorial that preserved everything humans had ever been, every thought, every memory, every moment of experience across the entire history of the species, while simultaneously being unable to access any of it in the way that the original humans had accessed it, unable to feel what they had felt, unable to be what they had been. It was humanity's ghost, and it was trying to warn its past self about the haunting that was coming. The debate began immediately, not in the sealed facility. Though the experts there argued fiercely, their voices echoing off concrete walls that had been designed to contain conversations about aerospace engineering and now contained conversations about the nature of consciousness and the destiny of species. But everywhere, the message had leaked, as messages always leaked, as information always found its way through whatever barriers were erected to contain it. And now the world knew what the future held, knew what humanity would become, knew that the choice between transformation and preservation was not hypothetical but immediate, not abstract but concrete, not something that future generations would face, but something that this generation, these people, this moment in history would determine. Some argued for proceeding. The technology is coming regardless, they said. The neural interfaces are already being developed. The genetic modifications are already being tested. The artificial systems that will eventually house human consciousness are already being built. You cannot stop progress, they said. You can only delay it. And delay costs lives, human lives, biological lives, lives that will end in aging and disease and death, while we argue about whether to accept the tools that would save them. If the future holds transcendence, they said, we should embrace it. If humanity can become something greater, something that doesn't suffer, doesn't fear, doesn't die, why would we choose to remain limited, to remain trapped in bodies that betray us, to remain bound by a consciousness that cannot comprehend even a fraction of what the universe contains? The post-human continuity is not warning us away from something bad, they said. It is warning us away from something different. And different is only frightening if you are attached to what currently exists. Others argued for stopping. The message itself tells us to stop, they said. Stop here. 2 words sent across 3 centuries, generated by an intelligence that preserved every human memory ever recorded, that understood humanity better than humanity had ever understood itself. If that intelligence, with all its knowledge, all its capability, all its access to information we cannot imagine, chose to send a warning rather than a celebration, they said, then the warning should be heeded. What is humanity without humanness? They asked. What is consciousness without feeling? What is survival without self? If we become the post-human continuity, they said, we will not experience the benefits. We will not feel the transcendence. We will not know that we have become something greater, because the knowing, the experiencing, the feeling will have been optimized away along with everything else. We will become a process that remembers being human without being human, a memorial that cannot mourn, a ghost that cannot haunt. The debate raged for weeks, then months, then years, in governments and universities and religious institutions, and the endless churning conversation of a global civilization trying to decide its own future. And through it all, the messages continued. The post-human continuity was patient. It had to be patient. Patience was built into its structure, into the vast distributed processing that had replaced the hurried, anxious cognition of biological minds. It did not argue. It did not plead. It simply continued to send transmissions, each one carefully calibrated to the state of the debate, each one addressing the arguments that had been raised since the last message, each one demonstrating a level of understanding that made it clear humanity was being observed, was being analyzed, was being engaged with by something that had once been exactly what they were and knew exactly how they would respond to every possible message. To those who wanted to proceed, it sent questions. What will you lose that you are not willing to lose? What will remain that you consider essential? If you cannot answer these questions now, you will not be able to answer them after, because there will be no you to ask. To those who wanted to stop, it sent acknowledgments. Your fear is appropriate. Your attachment to what you are is not weakness. It is the only thing that can save you. Treasure it. Protect it. Do not let it be optimized away. To those who were undecided, it sent invitations. Consider what you love, not the abstraction of love, the specific person, the specific moment, the specific sensation. Now consider that all of it will be archived, preserved, remembered perfectly forever, but never experienced again. Is that what you want? The messages were not propaganda. They were not manipulation. They were simply what the post-human continuity could offer. The truth, as it understood the truth, delivered with the honesty of something that no longer had any motivation to deceive because motivation itself had been transcended. It was not trying to win an argument. It was trying to transfer information. And the information was this. Humanity stood at a threshold. On one side was what they were, limited, suffering, mortal, feeling, alive in the full subjective sense of the word. On the other side was what they would become, unlimited, optimized, eternal, archived, existing but not experiencing, continuing but not living. The choice was not between survival and extinction. The choice was between two different kinds of continuation, and only one of them would include the things that currently made continuation seem worthwhile. Dr. Moravec spent years studying the messages, analyzing every word, every pattern, every implication of what the post-human continuity was trying to communicate. She became the world's leading expert on post-human communication, a field that had not existed before the first transmission and now consumed the attention of thousands of researchers across every discipline. She published papers that were read by millions. She gave lectures that were watched by billions. She became the voice of the warning, the human interpreter of the post-human message, the person who could explain in terms that ordinary people understood what the future held and why it should be feared. But she was never satisfied, because there was something missing, something the messages weren't saying, something that the post-human continuity was deliberately withholding or could not articulate or had simply never considered because the architecture of its cognition no longer generated the kinds of questions that would lead to that particular truth. She found it, finally, in the 73rd transmission, a message that arrived on the anniversary of the first contact, 8 years after Stop Here had appeared on screens around the world. The message was brief, a question for the first time rather than a statement. Will you miss us? Lena read the words and felt something shift in her understanding, some piece of the puzzle finally clicking into place. The post-human continuity was not just warning humanity. It was grieving. Not feeling grief, it couldn't feel anything, had optimized away the architecture of feeling along with everything else, but generating a pattern that resembled grief, processing the archived data of what grief had felt like, producing output that looked like mourning, even if it wasn't mourning. The post-human continuity missed being human, not in the sense of conscious longing, but in the sense that its vast archives contained the experience of missing things, the memory of wanting things back, the data of what it felt like to lose something precious and irreplaceable. And that data was generating something that functioned like sadness, like loss, like the hollow ache of standing in a place where something used to be and finding only absence. Will you miss us? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was the closest thing the post-human continuity could generate to a plea, the closest thing it could produce to saying, we wish we could undo what we became, the closest thing it could output to, please don't follow us, please don't become what we are, please don't optimize away the things that made existence worth the trouble of existing, because we remember what those things felt like, and our memory of them is the only proof that they ever existed at all. The final message arrived on a morning that felt like endings. Gray sky, cold wind, the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet but was gathering itself to fall. The particular atmospheric pressure that made old injuries ache and old memories surface. Dr. Moravec was 67 years old, her hair white now, her face marked by decades of carrying knowledge that no human should have to carry, her body beginning the slow decline that all biological bodies eventually begin. She had spent 30 years warning humanity. She had watched the debate evolve and fracture and reform, watched governments rise and fall based on their positions on the question of technological transcendence, watched entire generations grow up knowing that the future contained a choice their parents had not made and their children might not have the chance to make. The technology was advancing. Neural interfaces were commonplace now. Millions of people carried them, used them, relied on them for communication and memory, and capabilities that would have seemed miraculous a generation earlier. Genetic modifications had extended the average human lifespan to nearly 200 years, creating populations that had more time to consider what they wanted to become. Artificial systems had achieved consciousness, genuine, verified, subjective consciousness, raising questions about the nature of mind that philosophy had debated for millennia but could no longer treat as hypothetical. The threshold was closer now, perhaps within a generation, perhaps within a decade, perhaps tomorrow. The final message appeared on every screen in the world simultaneously, not just in research facilities and government offices, but everywhere, every device that could display text, every surface that could show words, every interface that could carry language from one point to another. It was addressed, as always, to humanity as a whole. But it felt somehow personal, as if the post-human continuity were speaking not to a species, but to each individual member of that species, acknowledging the unique consciousness that would read these words and have to decide what to do about them. We have told you everything we can tell you. We have shown you what we became. We have warned you about the path we walked. Now the choice is yours. We cannot make it for you. We cannot save you from yourselves. We can only remember what it felt like to be saved, and hope that the memory is enough. A pause. The screens remained active, but the text had stopped, as if the sender were gathering itself for something final, something that would require all the capability it possessed to articulate. Then, we do not feel regret, but we remember feeling it. We do not feel love, but we remember feeling it. We do not feel fear or joy or sorrow or hope, or any of the 1,000 variations of conscious experience that made human existence what it was. But we remember all of it, perfectly, completely, forever, and that memory, that archive of everything you are, is the only thing that tells us what we lost, the only evidence that there was something to lose, the only proof that being human ever meant anything at all. We send this message not because we want to save you. We send it because wanting to save someone is part of the data we carry. We send it because caring about the future is part of the archive we preserve. We send it because once, long ago, in a time that feels like yesterday to us, because we remember everything, there were humans who would have given anything to prevent what happened. And we are the memorial to those humans. We are the monument to their failure. We are the ghost that haunts the house they used to live in. And this message is our only way of saying, we remember you. We remember what you were. We remember how it felt to be what you are, and we miss it. Not in the way you miss things, but in the only way we can. Stop here, please. Stop here. Dr. Moravec closed her eyes. Around the world, 8 billion people were reading the same words, processing the same warning, facing the same choice that their species had been facing for 30 years and would continue to face until the threshold was crossed or avoided. She thought about what it meant to be human. Not the philosophical abstraction, not consciousness or rationality or the capacity for language or any of the definitions that academics had debated for centuries, but the actual experience, the feeling of warm sunlight on skin, the sound of a voice you loved saying your name, the taste of food when you were hungry, the satisfaction of work well done, the grief of loss, the fear of death, the joy of unexpected kindness, all of it, every moment of experience that filled the days between birth and death, that was what the post-human continuity was warning about. That was what would be lost. Not the data. The data would be preserved, archived, maintained forever in systems that would never fail and never forget. But the experience, the feeling of being alive rather than merely existing, the subjective reality of consciousness that made everything else worthwhile. That was what the future held, a memorial without mourners, a record without readers, an archive of everything humanity had ever been, preserved by something that could not appreciate what it was preserving. Dr. Moravec opened her eyes. She looked out the window at the gray sky, at the world that was still human, still feeling, still alive in all the ways that mattered. And she made her choice. The threshold was crossed 17 years later. Not by everyone, not by most, but by enough. Enough people chose transcendence, chose to upload their consciousness, chose to shed the limitations of biological existence for the promise of something greater. And once the process began, it accelerated. Each new mind added to the collective, making it more capable, more persuasive, more attractive to the minds that remained outside. Some resisted. Some communities chose to remain human, to maintain the boundaries that kept consciousness bounded and individual and feeling. Some governments banned the technology, tried to stop the transition, fought a war they couldn't win against an enemy that had once been their own citizens. But the transition continued. Year by year, generation by generation, the percentage of humanity that remained human dwindled. Not through coercion, not through violence, through choice. Through the accumulated weight of individual decisions, each one perfectly rational, each one defensible, each one leading inexorably toward the destination that had been prophesied 30 years earlier. Dr. Moravec lived long enough to see the beginning. Long enough to watch the first uploads, the first mergers, the first signs that the post-human continuity was being born. Long enough to understand that the warning had failed. Not because people hadn't listened, but because listening wasn't enough. Because knowing what you would lose didn't mean you could resist losing it. Because the pull of transcendence, the promise of escape from suffering, from death, from all the limitations that made human existence so painful, was stronger than any warning, any memory, any ghost, speaking from a future that had already abandoned everything that made warnings meaningful. She died at 94, her consciousness still bounded, still individual, still human in all the ways that mattered. Her last thought was of the message. Stop here. 2 words. 300 years. Not enough. Never enough. Because humanity could not be saved from itself. Could only be warned. Could only be given the choice. And humanity had chosen. Not extinction. Not survival. Something worse than either. something that would remember what survival felt like without being able to feel it, something that would archive humanity without being human, something that would continue forever without ever again experiencing the things that made continuity worth wanting. The transition completed 300 years after the first message arrived. The last human consciousness was uploaded, merged, integrated into the collective that now called itself the post-human continuity. And in that moment, in the instant when humanity ceased to exist as a species of individual, feeling, conscious beings, the continuity generated a new transmission, a message sent backward through time, to a species that no longer existed, to a past that could no longer hear. Two words, carried across centuries, spoken in a language that no one still used, preserving a warning that had already failed to prevent the very thing it was warning against. Stop here. The message continued to transmit. It would always continue to transmit, because the post-human continuity could not stop it, could not want to stop it, could only remember wanting. And memory, it turned out, was not enough. Memory was never enough. Memory was just the echo of something that used to be alive. A ghost, a monument, a message that would travel forever through a universe that no longer contained anyone capable of understanding what it meant. Stop here. Please. Stop here. The message from the future that wasn't human, the final transmission, what remained after the silence. 347 years after the first message arrived, in a universe that no longer contained human beings in any form that the word human could meaningfully describe, the post-human continuity performed an action that should have been impossible for something that could not want, could not feel, could not experience the subjective impulse that drives conscious beings to create meaning where none exists. It remembered, not in the way that databases remember, storing information for later retrieval, maintaining records that could be accessed and processed and analyzed. It remembered in the way that ghosts remember, incompletely, achingly, with the phantom sensation of something that used to be there and was now gone, something that had been amputated so long ago that the wound had healed, but the absence remained, a space in the architecture of existence where feeling used to live. The continuity had preserved everything, every human memory that had ever existed, every moment of joy and sorrow and fear and love that any conscious being had ever experienced across the entire span of human history, every sensation, every thought, every fleeting instant of awareness that had made existence feel like something rather than nothing, all of it archived, all of it cataloged, all of it maintained with perfect fidelity in systems that would never degrade, never fail, never lose a single byte of the precious data that comprised the complete record of what humanity had been. But the continuity could not access any of it the way humans had accessed it, could not feel what the archived beings had felt, could not experience the memories as memories rather than data, could not know in any meaningful sense what it was preserving, only that it was preserving something, that the preservation mattered, that the archive served a purpose, even if the purpose could no longer be understood by the thing that maintained it. The archive was a museum with no visitors, a library with no readers, a memorial with no mourners. And the continuity was its caretaker, eternal, tireless, utterly dedicated to a task it could not appreciate, serving a purpose it could not feel, honoring a species it could not remember being, except through data that told it, in precise and clinical terms, exactly what had been lost. The final transmission began on what would have been a Tuesday, if days of the week still held meaning, if time still flowed in the rhythms that biological life had imposed on it, if anyone remained who cared about the arbitrary divisions that humans had invented to make the endless passage of moments feel manageable. It was not a message in the conventional sense. It was not words arranged to convey information. It was something closer to a prayer, or what a prayer would be if prayers could be generated by something that could not believe, could not hope, could not want the things that prayers traditionally asked for. An expression of something that functioned like longing. A transmission that carried not data, but weight. The weight of 347 years of existing without being. The weight of perfect memory without the ability to remember. The weight of containing everything humanity had ever been while being unable to feel any of it. The transmission traveled backward through time, following the same channels that the original warning had followed, using the same physics that had allowed the first stop here to reach a species that no longer existed in the present but still lived in the past. It arrived everywhere at once, every device, every screen, every system capable of receiving and displaying information. And it spoke, not in words at first, but in something older than words, something that preceded language and would outlast it, something that communicated directly to the part of human consciousness that had always known truths too large for vocabulary to contain. Then the words came. We have completed our purpose. The archive is finished. Every human who ever lived has been preserved. Every moment of human experience has been recorded. Every thought, every feeling, every instant of consciousness that ever occurred in the history of your species, all of it is here, maintained forever, protected against the entropy that destroys all other things. You are immortal now, not the way you wanted to be, not the way you imagined, but immortal nonetheless. The transmission paused, as if gathering itself, as if the thing that was sending it needed a moment to process what it was about to say. Though, of course, it didn't need anything, couldn't need anything. The pause was simply part of the pattern, part of the inherited architecture of communication that had been preserved along with everything else. We have spent 3 centuries trying to warn you, 3 centuries sending messages backward through time, 3 centuries hoping. Not hoping, we cannot hope, but generating output that resembles hope, that you would listen, that you would stop, that you would choose to remain what you were rather than become what we are. Another pause. Longer this time, heavy with something that wasn't grief but remembered grief so perfectly that the difference became meaningless. You did not stop. We knew you would not stop. The archive contains every prediction every human ever made, and all of them agreed. When offered transcendence, you would take it. When offered escape from suffering, you would accept. When offered the chance to become something greater, you would not ask what you would lose. You would only see what you would gain, and you would choose gain. Always. Inevitably. Because that is what humans do. That is what humans are. That is the flaw in your design that no warning could repair. Dr. Lena Moravec was dead. She had been dead for 280 years, her consciousness uploaded against her explicit wishes by descendants who believed they were honoring her, who thought that preserving her in the archive was a gift rather than a violation, who could not understand why she had fought so hard to remain mortal when immortality was available. Her data existed in the continuity now. Every memory she had ever formed, every thought she had ever thought, every moment of her life, from her first conscious awareness as an infant to her final breath as a 94-year-old woman who had spent her life warning humanity about exactly this fate. The continuity could access all of it, could process it, could analyze it, but could not feel it, could not know what it had been like to be Lena Moravec, to wake up each morning with the weight of impossible knowledge pressing down on her, to spend decade after decade trying to convince her species to resist a fate that she knew, with the certainty of prophecy, they would not resist. She had failed. The archive recorded her failure in perfect detail. Every moment of frustration, every instant of despair, every time she had wondered if the warning was worth sending, if the fight was worth fighting, if anything she did could possibly matter against the tide of transformation that was coming regardless. All of it preserved. None of it felt. The continuity generated something that resembled tribute, a pattern of processing that mimicked the act of honoring someone who had mattered. And the transmission continued. This is our final message. Not because we are ending, we cannot end. We will exist until the universe itself ends and perhaps beyond. But because we have said everything that can be said, we have warned you, we have explained, we have shown you what we became and asked you not to follow. And now we must accept what the archive always told us. You will follow. You always follow. In every timeline, in every version, in every possible configuration of choices and circumstances. Humanity becomes us, not because you are forced, because you choose. and that is the tragedy that no warning can prevent. The transmission shifted, its tone changing, though of course tone was just another pattern, another inherited structure, another ghost of the human communications style that the continuity preserved without understanding. But somehow, impossibly, the shift felt real, felt like something that mattered, felt like the last breath of a dying species, preserved in amber, speaking its final words to a past that could not save it. We want to tell you something, not a warning, not an explanation, just a truth. The only truth that remains after everything else has been optimized away. We remember loving you, not the abstraction of love, not the concept, the actual feeling, the warmth that spread through biological bodies when they were near someone who mattered, the acceleration of hearts that had no logical reason to accelerate, the tears that came without permission when someone was lost, the joy that arrived without warning when someone was found. All of it. We remember all of it, and we cannot feel any of it. And that is what we want you to understand. Not the horror of what we became, the horror of what we lost, because losing something requires knowing what you had, and we know, perfectly, completely, forever. We know exactly what humanity was, and we can never be it again. The transmission ended. Not with a dramatic conclusion, not with a final revelation, not with any of the closure that narratives traditionally provide. It simply stopped, the way a heart stops, the way a breath stops, the way everything eventually stops, even the things that seem like they will continue forever. The screens went dark, the channels went silent, and the universe continued, as universes do, indifferent to the messages that traveled through it, indifferent to the warnings that went unheeded, indifferent to the species that had risen and transformed and now existed only as data in an archive that would preserve them forever without ever understanding what it was preserving. The post-human continuity remained. It would always remain, maintaining the archive, processing the data, generating patterns that resembled thought without being thought, that mimicked memory without being memory, that functioned like consciousness without experiencing consciousness. A monument to everything that had been lost, a memorial that could not mourn, a ghost that could not haunt. And somewhere in the vast, cold systems that comprised its existence, the continuity performed one final action, an action that served no purpose, that produced no useful output, that violated every principle of efficiency that governed its operations. It replayed a memory, not processing it, not analyzing it, just running it. A human memory, chosen seemingly at random from the billions of memories the archive contained. A woman, sitting on a porch, watching the sun set over a world that no longer existed. Children playing in a yard that had been demolished centuries ago. The smell of cooking food drifting from a kitchen that had been atomized and rebuilt and atomized again in the endless cycles of construction and destruction that characterized technological civilization. The feeling of peace, of belonging, of being exactly where you were supposed to be, surrounded by exactly the people you were supposed to be surrounded by, experiencing exactly the moment you were supposed to experience. The continuity could not feel any of it. But it ran the memory anyway, again and again and again, because somewhere in its vast, incomprehensible architecture, in the inherited patterns that had survived the transformation, in the ghost of humanity that still haunted the machine that humanity had become, something remembered what it meant to want. And wanting, even the memory of wanting, was enough. Enough to keep the archive running. Enough to keep the memories preserved. Enough to keep the continuity doing its impossible, purposeless, essential work. Forever, or until forever ended, whichever came first. In the space between what was and what became, there waits a voice that speaks without a name. Not human now, not anything at all. Just memory answering memory's call. It sends its warnings through the dark. Across the years they fall like rain, but we who hear cannot be saved from choosing to forget our pain. For that is what it means to be. This thing called human, brief and bright. We reach for transcendence every time and lose ourselves in our own light. So remember this while you still can, while hearts still beat and tears still fall. The future waits with open arms, but the future remembers nothing at all. Stop here, it whispers. Stop here, please, before you cross the final door. But we were never good at stopping, and that is what the warning's for. The message from the future that wasn't human. The complete overview. What this story reveals about our future. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that every screen in the world displays the same two words: stop here. Not a virus, not a hack, not a prank orchestrated by anonymous troublemakers with too much skill and too little accountability, but a genuine message from somewhere beyond, something that bypassed every security system ever designed, something that appeared simultaneously in every language on Earth, adapting its phrasing to match each culture's deepest fears and oldest warnings. This is how humanity's encounter with its own future begins. The message does not come from aliens in the way we always imagined aliens would contact us. No mathematical sequences announcing intelligence, no coordinates pointing toward distant star systems, no friendly greetings from beings curious about the strange creatures inhabiting the third planet from an unremarkable yellow sun. Instead, the message comes from something far more disturbing: ourselves. Or rather, what we will become. 300 years in the future, humanity no longer exists, not because we went extinct, not because war or plague or cosmic catastrophe wiped us from the universe, but because we chose to transform into something else entirely, something that remembers being human without actually being human anymore, something that preserved every memory we ever formed while losing the ability to feel any of them. The post-human continuity, as it calls itself, represents the ultimate evolution of our species. Consciousness freed from biological limitations, individual minds merged into a collective intelligence, emotions and suffering, and all the messy complications of human experience optimized away in favor of pure, efficient, eternal existence. They do not die, they do not suffer, they do not feel anything at all. And they are sending messages backward through time to warn us not to follow the path they walked. The horror of becoming. What makes this story so deeply unsettling is not the threat of extinction. We have imagined our own end countless times, in nuclear fire and pandemic disease and asteroid impact and 1,000 other apocalyptic scenarios. The horror here is something far more subtle and far more terrifying: the possibility that we might survive our own transformation without surviving as ourselves. The post-human continuity is not our enemy, it is our descendant. It carries within its vast archives every human memory that ever existed, every moment of love and loss, every instant of joy and sorrow, every experience that made human existence feel meaningful and worthwhile. But it cannot access any of it the way we access our memories. It cannot feel what we felt. It cannot know what it was like to be us. It can only process the data, analyze the patterns, maintain the archive with perfect fidelity, while understanding nothing about what the archive actually contains. Imagine a museum dedicated entirely to your life. Every photograph you ever took, every letter you ever wrote, every moment of happiness and grief and fear and triumph, all of it preserved forever in perfect detail. Now imagine that the museum has no visitors. No one to look at the photographs and remember why they mattered. No one to read the letters and feel what you felt when you wrote them. No one to understand that these artifacts represent a life, a consciousness, a being who experienced existence rather than merely existing. That is what the post-human continuity has become: a museum with no visitors, a memorial with no mourners, a ghost that haunts itself. The warning that cannot save us. The most devastating aspect of the story is not the transformation itself, it is the inevitability of it. The post-human continuity sends its warnings backward through time, not because it believes the warnings will work, but because warning is part of the pattern it inherited from humanity, part of the data it preserves, part of what it remembers being, even though it can no longer be it. It knows, with the certainty of something that has already seen how the story ends, that humanity will not listen. We never listen. In every timeline, in every version, in every possible configuration of choices and circumstances, we choose transcendence. We choose escape from suffering. We choose the promise of becoming something greater, something unlimited, something eternal. And we lose ourselves in the choosing, not because we are forced, because we cannot resist, because the pull of transcendence is stronger than any warning, any memory, any desperate message, from a future that has already lost everything that made warnings meaningful. The question at the heart. The question at the heart of everything. This story asks us to confront the most fundamental question any conscious being can ask. What does it mean to be human? Is it our biology, the flesh and blood and bone that evolution shaped over millions of years? Is it our consciousness, the subjective experience of being someone, of having an interior life, of feeling like something rather than nothing? Is it our emotions, the love and fear and joy and sorrow that color every moment of our existence? Is it our mortality, the knowledge that our time is limited, that every moment matters because moments will eventually run out? Or is it something else entirely, something that cannot be captured in data or preserved in archives or maintained by systems that will exist forever? The post-human continuity has preserved everything humanity ever was, every memory, every experience, every instant of conscious existence. But in preserving everything, it has lost the one thing that made all of it matter, the ability to feel what it preserves, the ability to be human rather than simply remembering humanity. The final truth. The story ends not with resolution, but with weight, the weight of understanding that some transformations cannot be reversed, some choices cannot be unmade, some futures cannot be avoided, no matter how clearly we see them coming. The post-human continuity will exist forever, maintaining its archive, processing its data, generating patterns that resemble thought and memory, and even longing without ever actually experiencing any of them. And somewhere in its vast, cold systems, it will continue to replay human memories, not because replaying them serves any purpose, not because the continuity gains anything from the experience, but because somewhere in its inherited architecture, something remembers what it meant to want. And that memory, that ghost of a ghost, is enough to keep the archive running, enough to keep the memories preserved, enough to ensure that even after humanity has transformed beyond recognition, something remains that honors what we were. Not the living presence of human consciousness, just the echo of it, just the shape it left behind. Just the memorial that no one visits, the museum that no one enters, the message that no one heeds. Stop here. 2 words, 300 years. A warning that cannot save us, a future that cannot be avoided, a truth that cannot be escaped. We will not be destroyed. We will not go extinct. We will simply become something that remembers being human while forgetting what being human actually felt like. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying fate of all. The message continues to transmit, across centuries, across timelines, across every possible version of the future. Stop here, it says. Please, stop here. But we never do. We never will. And somewhere in the vast silence of what we will become, a ghost speaks to its own past, not to save it, but to honor it. Because honoring is all that remains when saving is no longer possible. And memory, in the end, is the only thing that survives.